Hi, I'm Melly.
Hi, I'm Jamie.
Hi, I'm Lauren, and we created Code My Crown.
Okay, Jamie, let's start with you. Can you describe the inception of Code My Crown? Where did the idea come from?
So ultimately, uh, millions of Black people play video games, and we saw on social media that despite this huge audience playing the video games, there was the depiction of black hair in gaming is pretty terrible. It's often inaccurate and highly stereotypical. And we saw that, and from a bit of research that we did into this, that we saw that 85% of Black gamers actually felt that it was poorly represented in video games. And given the work that Dove has done around the Crown Act and real virtual beauty, and ultimately it's just history in real beauty, we thought this was a really great place for an opportunity for us to come in and help, basically.
So, Lauren, when the team came to you with the idea for Code My Crown, like what was your first thought? And were there any barriers or anything that you felt like you might have to overcome to have the idea be created?
Yeah, so I think it made perfect sense just with all of the work that we're doing in the real world, with making sure that Black hair and textures and protective styles are respected and kind of seen and represented everywhere. So I think in principle, it made a lot of sense for the brand. I think what was both a little bit scary but also exciting is that gaming as a space was relatively new. We had done a little bit of work with our real virtual beauty, but hadn't necessarily kind of tied the work that we were doing with Crown within the space of gaming. And as we know, there's a lot of really strong and a really passionate community within the gaming space. So knowing that we needed to be really authentic and kind of hear and understand what the key issues were. I think it was exciting as from a newness perspective, but also took a lot of kind of learning and understanding that whole world of gaming, which is new for me personally, but exciting for us to be able to speak to communities that we already were speaking to in the real world.
Yes, the community aspect is so incredibly important, and I want to talk about that a little bit more. So, Jamie, talk a little bit about like the partners that we engaged and what insights they brought to the table when it came to actually making the work.
Yes, and I think before I even get into the partners, like video games, to give context, take, you know, years to make. It's not something that I turn around in like weeks or months, and it really is a special skill set. So we, worked in partnership with the open source Afro Hair Library as well as Black 3D artists to create the Code My Crown guide, because this is something that was beyond our skill set, and we wanted to make sure that it was done and done properly and done with authenticity and made sure that it was well represented. We did not want to fall into the same pitfalls as that others have in the past, and we wanted to make sure that anything we created had real value and would actually make a real tangible difference to the industry and developers working out there.
So I know that when the team talked to me about this idea, I was immediately excited, and I started bringing up like all of the spaces where I felt like curly hair, natural hair is like so poorly represented, and just like not designed for in different
Yeah.
digital spaces. So Jamie, like what were some of the technical hurdles that developers were facing when it came to actually like coding black hair textures, and how is like our solution really uniquely designed to address that?
And this is where working with such talented people, and they honestly were so inspiring and so amazing to work with, like the open source Afro Hair Library artists, as well as the Black 3D artists, like Isaac at Tallgran, were actually exceptional, because what we didn't know until we got into this project, which was there is actually limitations within the way that the development software works at the moment. So ultimately, the software is sort of basically built to cater to white hair. And so not only did they look at different artistic ways that the hair could be represented, but they also found workarounds to the restrictions of the actual development software, which was so impressive. And actually, they sort of, there was multiple different ways, and there are some styles that are still unable to be represented, but they found ways to represent many styles, which was really inspiring.
So knowing that since this campaign launched, like some of the top gaming companies are really adapting like the codes and standards from Code My Crown is incredibly exciting. Lauren, can you talk a little bit about what you feel is the biggest impact that this has had on the brand, as well as any, personal impact or stories that people have shared with you?
One of the things that was super exciting is for people within the gaming world to say this is not really expected of a beauty brand, but thank you for solving this problem that existed. And I think that kind of speaks to the ethos of Dove is any kind of opportunities that we see or any barriers that we see to that kind of mission of beauty inclusivity. It's a place for us to play and a place for us to kind of enhance the experience for our audiences. So I think that alone is kind of a great example of it might not necessarily traditionally be a space that you would be expecting a beauty brand, but a lot of the things that we're fighting in the real world are still kind of being seen across different forms of media. So hearing that from gamers, that kind of unexpected, but really grateful and kind of thankful that we were helping and pushing the industry. I think that's the kind of big piece is that as a brand, we think it's important not just to spotlight an issue, but to make tangible change towards it. And so what that looks like in the real world is, of course, advocating for legislation so that race-based hair discrimination doesn't happen. But what that looks like in different spaces, and especially for Code My Crown, is how we can push the industry. So it's not just us as a single brand, but we're partnering, as Jamie mentioned, with Black greedy artists, with other organizations and people within this space, but then also kind of bringing along the entire industry to try to make change. I think that's also what's so lovely about this resource being free and open access with open access, is that it is something that we're trying to democratize and really kind of encouraging people to join us on this journey, and that we can't do it alone. So I feel that that's kind of one of the biggest pieces of impact is just pushing society to realize that there's still so much work to be done, but also taking our industry and kind of adjacent industries to move the needle and continue taking action in the way that we have been for decades. So that as long as that, along with other kind of personal stories and anecdotes that I've heard from friends who are gamers or even kind of strangers posting on the internet of how this has been a pain point for them in spaces that they love and see community in, that it's just something as simple as character creation can really make or break your experience. So hearing that this is a step in the right direction is really gratifying. And it's great to know that we are part of that movement to make people's experience, make people feel seen and feel heard within the spaces that they're
And
Amazing.
to just build on that as well, I think for anybody that doesn't understand the context of gaming, is at the beginning of the game, you set your character, your avatar of who you're going to be in that game. And if you can't see yourself there and you're not represented, it is almost like a bit of a sign to a huge audience that they're not welcome there, as they're not, meant to be part of that game or that universe. And I think from the interviews and the discussions that we had with gamers, this was the moment where they really felt the pain point the most. And actually giving the industry those tools to better represent those millions of Black gamers out there, I think is a great step in the right direction. And I think to sort of build on Lauren's point there, we wanted to lead from the front. We didn't want to shame. We wanted to make sure that this was a positive campaign that sort of pointed people in the right direction to help create that positive change so that everybody is, sees themselves realized with the respect, care, and accuracy that they deserve.
Okay, so Lauren, at a time where, so many brands seem to be pulling back from a lot of their racial equity commitments and are really nervous about taking actions that they might fear can be considered too political, like what advice would you give a brand leader if they see something they're excited about and want to energize their organization to be brave to invest in?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things is just making sure that all of the activities that you do really align to your mission to make sure that it's as authentic as possible. I think a lot of the pitfalls is if people see an issue, but it might not necessarily align with anything that they've done, or they might not have the credibility or the relationships and kind of with the communities that they're trying to solve for. And so I think kind of making sure that you're working with the communities that you want to make change with, which is kind of the table stakes of any sort of work that we do within the space of diversity and inclusion and advocacy. And we've seen that authenticity is key. And so that just making sure that you're authentically speaking with those communities, working with the communities. And I think consistency is also a really big piece. It's not enough to just step in to help a community donate or do kind of one initiative and then back out and move on to the next one. One of the things that we find is really important and critical to the work that we do is by standing with those communities and kind of staying consistent in those spaces so that you can make real tangible change and not kind of putting a Band-Aid on a larger issue. So we've been doing the work within beauty inclusivity. It's our 20th anniversary of the Dove Self-Esteem Project and the Campaign for Real Beauty. So it's kind of been within our brand DNA and ethos to be fighting for this. And there might be spaces that are newer for us, so gaming, for example, but the communities and making sure that we're really solving for a real issue are some of the ways that we can make sure we're making real impact and communicating with authenticity and maintaining those relationships with communities.
Okay, so so we know that the work is not done. What would you say is the next chapter of this initiative in the digital space?
I would say, so as part of our kind of general work within the movement, we're continuing to champion and spotlight and celebrate natural hair textures and styles. So as we continue advocating in the real world for things like the Crown Act and passing in more states, within the virtual world, it's really kind of gaining more visibility of the guide, making sure that people know that it exists, that it's easily accessible, and then also having conversations with people in the industry to make sure that we can see this kind of play out so that the styles and textures that are represented within gaming titles are realized for gamers and they can kind of see themselves within those worlds.
To build on that as well, you know, I think the next phase as well is working with the studios, with them now in partnership. I think we've, and obviously the open source Afro Hair Library and Black 3D artists, and actually bringing everyone to the table for the betterment of the future of the industry and making sure that these styles get adopted in future games and other styles beyond as well.
All right, so, you know, the moment of launch, right? The most exciting moment. All of this work went on behind the scenes with all the partners, and finally the work was out there in the world. What was the reception like, Lauren?
Yeah, so I think it was overwhelmingly positive reception. The community, for example, within the gaming world was just, this is something that's a long time coming and conversations that have been happening. So I think there was a general kind of sigh of relief to some extent, but also just excitement about where the industry can go and all of the possibilities for different representations and depictions of hairstyles. So that was really exciting. I think seeing people within the industry, for example, like industry leaders at the biggest kind of gaming studios and within the gaming world, advocating for and kind of saying that this is something that's really necessary and a resource that will be so useful for the people within their organizations. So I think that was really exciting. I think it was also exciting to see the positive reception from people who aren't necessarily identifying as gamers, but that know the kind of experience of trying to find an emoji that looks like them or a memoji or something, that kind of digital representation. I think it's very clear that there's a need there. So overwhelmingly positive sentiment from both gamers and just the Black community and the industry, which I think kind of shows us that this is a real issue and something that there's way more work to be done, but that we're opening the aperture for that conversation.
It's so amazing when you find these problems that are hidden in plain sight. And for most people, like, you know, you try to create the avatar, you try to create the memoji, and it's disappointing, right? But you just accept that that's how the world is and you move on with your day, and that's just the architecture that you have to live in. So I feel like when a brand or when an individual really like changes that architecture fundamentally, it's like, you know, the ability to feel seen is amazing, and the reception, it sounds like, was the same.
Especially too for people that might not have that experience, but it also becomes a learning experience for those of, wow, I didn't realize what that, you know, like I am able to see myself in the avatars I create. I didn't know that my fellow gamers were experiencing that, and I think that kind of learning overall is also helpful for us to understand that there are many spaces within beauty and representation that still have a lot of work to be done to make people feel welcome.
Thank you for joining us for Dove Code My Crown Behind the Work, the latest chapter in Dove's actions to change beauty for good. This campaign was all about changing how developers are programming and coding natural hair in gaming environments and transforming the way that Black gamers can see themselves in those worlds. Thank you.